All right. Hey, everybody. Happy Thursday, October 29th. I haven't done a hangout in ages. It's probably been 6 months or more. And I'm not sure that I won't regret starting over again. But I thought I wanted to chat a little bit, and no one's come in the room yet, so that's fine. I'll just talk on my own. I don't have a problem doing that. Um, Sorry, excuse me while I adjust my little monitor here. All right. Um, I want to talk a little bit about this notion of killing versus murder. And I think most of you that have had any discussions at all know what I'm talking about. You don't have to hang out in a theist's hangout too long, usually, before you'll come across this argument that, the commandment, sixth commandment, right, I believe, thou shalt not kill, is actually not a correct translation, or an accurate translation, I should say, and that in Hebrew it actually says thou shalt not murder, and that there is a distinction between murder and killing. Now, there are a lot of little points around this that I find interesting, so forgive me if I bounce around a little bit. I'm not doing this from notes, I'm just winging this. I saw a Google page today by a rabbi um, who was making a point about this verse, and whose claim is, or he says that since it has been so ubiquitously mistranslated over the years, that an uncountable number of lives have been lost due to unnecessary pacifism. Okay, he believes that so many people have read this and thought it said that do not kill. That in the light of maybe their own life being threatened, they refuse to take up arms and fight back, thinking that they were being disobedient to one of God's commandments. Well, first of all, let me say I'm not entirely in agreement with this guy that there's been an overabundance of pacifism in the name of Christianity. Or Judaism, for that matter, in terms of people being run over and not fighting back. But I will let that go for the time being, and just kind of look at this idea, or this notion. So, assuming that the translation is correct, and I believe it is, I don't think there's any reason to doubt that the word actually does say murder and not killing. There is, of course, I think, a world of difference between saying that you should not murder and sort of leaving this idea of killing undiscussed or unaddressed. There's a world difference between that and saying that you should take up arms to defend yourself, or have an obligation to do so. In other words, if somebody comes into my house with a gun and points it at me, or I'm walking down the street and somebody tries to mug me and points a gun at me, and I feel my life is at risk, it's one thing to say that the commandment doesn't prevent me, or doesn't say that I'm doing anything immoral or sinful should I take a gun out and shoot this guy. Okay. But that's not the same thing as saying that I'm obligated to do it. And I'm not so sure, in the light, for Christians at least, I'm not so sure that in the light of most of Jesus's passages or ideas, I'm not so sure that a Christian can justify um, protecting his own life and taking someone else's. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about all the justifications that typically go along with that, like, oh, I got a family, to care for. Well, maybe the guy holding the gun does too, or all these other things. I mean, Jesus clearly did say, several times in the New Testament, that to love your brother, or to love someone, means to be willing to sacrifice your life for theirs. So, and this isn't my primary point, but I do think it's an interesting thing to consider. That Christians, as soon as they say, "Oh, this means murder," it doesn't mean killing, immediately feel perfectly fine picking up a gun now and blowing away the guy that's trying to rob them or trying to steal their TV out of their house. And I'm not really sure that the rest of Jesus's philosophy would be in line with that kind of action. That's one thing. But here's the maybe more of the crux of the issue for me. If God said this, so we're going to assume for argument's sake that he did, and if he in fact said murder and not kill, and we're going to assume that as well, he chose, right, a word, a human word, murder, as opposed to killing, to communicate this notion or his idea of morality. But you have to stop and ask yourself, how precisely were the Jews at the time when God gave the commandment on Mount Sinai, at that moment? How did those people right there, the ones who received it, how did they define or distinguish murder from killing? Because truly, it makes absolutely no difference how we define it and how we differentiate it now. God wasn't addressing. In other words, the word has changed. The words as humans use it has changed over the centuries. I'm sure that distinction has flowed or ebbed back and forth in terms of what was murder and what constituted killing. I'm not sure that there were always clear lines there, and certainly that they weren't always the same clear lines. So when God uttered this command and said, "Thou shalt not murder," it only makes sense to understand that as the Jews would have understood it who actually received the word, and not in any translation that any change that happened down the road. Now, I don't know how they understood it. Now, maybe somebody could do a little research, a little anthropological research, and possibly be able to produce enough artifacts from that time period, that generation, to be able to say with reasonable certainty what goes in what category and what goes in the other. But I think that's a long way from the way that most Christians do it, which is to look at it from our perspective now and say, oh, well, looking at civil laws, looking at culture, and saying, oh, well, this constitutes murder, this is just killing, this is okay. I'm not sure that those distinctions would have been the same back then. If your argument is going to be that that is okay, that we should look at it from our time perspective, then I think we have a problem with how Christians typically define the notion or the concept of morality or absolute morals or objective morals, right? If how we categorize taking a life between murder and killing has in fact changed over the years, okay, then clearly the moral nature of an act of taking someone's life, whether it is moral or immoral, has then changed over the years. All right. In other words, if it follows the flow of how humans understand the words, then clearly something that may have been perfectly moral in one century might be entirely immoral in the next, and it might revert back to being moral yet again a century later. So clearly, I think that is in conflict with what most Christians talk about as absolute or objective morality. And there may be some out there that don't look at it this way, but from the ones that I've talked to primarily, there seems to be this notion of unchanging morals that proceed from God are fixed in terms of their content or in what becomes moral and what's immoral. So I think that's a problem. There is another argument, that I'm sure some Christians or theists out there might make, and it might be along these lines. They're going to say, well, it's not that God's notion of what was moral changed because humans changed the words over the century. It's that God always considered those things moral or immoral. It's simply that humans hadn't gotten around. We were farther away from what God's understanding was. And as we progressed, we've gotten closer to what God's understanding is. So the longer we kind of persist and the longer these words morph and change, ultimately the closer they get to what God had intended. But he intended that all along. I can't buy that either. I don't think it's a really good argument, clearly, because if God gave the commandment to people at Mount Sinai, he intended them to understand it in their context, not in the context of some future generation. So even though you might say now, maybe we find something that we have something in the killing category that maybe back then they had in the murder category, right? I'm sure they didn't get to play that game. They didn't get to say, well, I know we think of it as murder, but I think in the future, I actually think it's a killing thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. And it's not a sin, or there's nothing immoral there, because I'm certain that even though everybody else doesn't agree with me now, down the road, they're all going to see the light, and that's probably what God intended in the first place. Yeah, I don't think God would have let them play that game, so I don't think it's fair that we play that game either. Um, so it seems to me, anyway, that there are some real problems here, not just in terms of what constitutes murder versus what constitutes killing, but as I said, even if something falls in the killing category, saying that it's not immoral, or that it's saying that God says it's not immoral specifically, um, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Right? And I think too many people jump to that conclusion that they're one and the same. But more so, I'm reasonably certain that that definition has changed over the centuries. And so, if that's the case, then which definition of killing and murder is the one that we need to apply? And if we're applying the one, if you say, no, you're right, it's the one that was at Mount Sinai, it's their version, their definition of murder and killing. Well, again, then I think there are two issues that creep up here. One is, how close can we actually get to understanding what their definition was, right? Because if they are anything like us, granted, they didn't have Google Plus back in Mount Sinai days, but if they did, I suspect, if you got any 20 Jews on Google Plus at Mount Sinai, you probably would have gotten 20 different, or at least 10 different variations on a theme as to what things were murder and what were killing, right? If they're anything like us, right? Because you get 20 atheists or 20 theists or 20 anything on Google Plus, and even if you go to a fundamental question like what, define God, you'll get 10 different answers. So even there, it becomes now difficult to know what exactly was in God's mind when he picked a human word and didn't offer any more clarification, because obviously many people might have understood what goes in those categories very differently. And then how do you know who's right, who's wrong, who has the mind of God here? And again, I think the other problem is, if you say that it's what, even if we could define what somebody thought at Mount Sinai, right? Let's say it's Moses. We go with Moses there. I'm sorry. Yeah. Um, um, Yeah, sorry about that. I just drew a blank on something. Anyway, even if we say it was, what people thought at the time on Mount Sinai, clearly, without further delineation or specifics, we have categories. We have ways, maybe of taking a human life now that maybe they didn't have back then, or right, whether it be by technology or some other reason, that we have ways now of doing things that nobody had back then. Therefore, they weren't classified back then, which means we have to classify them now. Well, again, who gets to decide now what it was that God meant then, if it didn't cover the particular situation in any detail? In other words, if we're left to sort it out for ourselves, what does it mean? Okay. So anyway, just some thoughts. I think there's other ones out there, but since Hangouts seem to have gone out of style, uh, maybe this will be my one and only. But I thought there were some interesting questions there. That when theists say, well, it's murder, it's not killing. That's all well and good, but I think unfortunately what happens in conversation is that's sort of the end of that line of discussion. Everybody goes, oh, okay, yeah. But I think there's more to it to that, and I think it needs to be put under a microscope and examined more, because I think there are a lot of questions that are still left unanswered, and some issues that spring up depending on what path you take. Anyway, hope everybody enjoyed this. Go have a nice Thursday, and we'll talk to everybody later. Ciao.